Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our session on information and data quality. My name is Farhana Hossain. I'm a senior evidence advisor at Project Evident, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. So as we all know, data is the backbone of any AI system, but not all data is created equal, and not all uses of data look the same. So in this session, we're going to dig into what it actually means to have data that is ready to responsibly support AI. How do you evaluate whether your data is fit for your purpose, your organization's purpose, and how do you set clear boundaries around what AI systems should and should not use? So before we dive in, a quick note on what we mean by AI. We're talking broadly here, not just chatbots and generative AI tools, but also machine learning, predictive modeling, and the full range of applications that fall under that umbrella. Some of you've probably heard this framing in earlier sessions today, but wanted us all to be grounded in that for this session as well. I'm very, very excited to introduce you to our panelists today. So Dr. Erika Van Buren is the founder and CEO of Line of Sight Consulting, where she works with foundations, nonprofits, public agencies, and many other mission-driven organizations to strengthen their capacity for improvement and impact. She is a nationally recognized leader in evaluation, capacity building, applied research, and systems change strategy. Erika also brings an important practitioner lens to this conversation as someone who has worked inside nonprofit settings to make data and technology usable in real decisions and workflows, including building predictive AI tools at First Place for Youth, an organization that works with foster youth, alongside our next panelist, Pete York, who is a chief data scientist at Project Evident. Pete leads the development and scaling of practitioner-centered, evidence-based services and tools. He has over 25 years of experience in evaluation methodology and data science, and is a recognized leader in integrating AI and machine learning into impact assessment. He has worked with the National Science Foundation, the World Bank, Department of Health and Human Services, Casey Family Programs, and state governments. And he's also on faculty at the Evaluators Institute at Claremont Graduate University, teaching courses on the use of machine learning and AI for evaluators. We were slated to have a third panelist today, Yeshimabeit Milner from Data for Black Lives, but unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us today due to unforeseen travel challenges. So we are really sorry to miss her voice in this conversation. Her work on data governance, advocacy, and community agency is incredibly important to this topic, but we're grateful for the insights she shared in preparation for this session. So we've integrated some of her insights in the conversation that we're about to have. So let's get started. Hi, Erika. Hi, Pete.
Hello, hello.
So one of the things I really appreciate about talking with two of you is that you each bring a different vantage point on the same core challenge, right? How do we use data responsibly and well? Erika, you work with organizations to strengthen how they collect, understand, and act on data. Pete, you bring the evaluation and data science lens, developing the analytic methods and tools that help practitioners generate evidence about what's working and how. So let me start with Erika. Erika, so as someone who works really closely with organizations on the space around capacity building, what are the most common gaps you see as organizations start thinking about AI for their work?
Yeah, thanks, Farhana, and thanks for the question. It's great to be here. It's great to be back with my buddy Pete. We've worked together for a very long time, so it's great to have the band back together.
Yes.
I would say the biggest gap is that organizations are being asked to think about AI before they've built the data and decision infrastructure that AI actually depends on. So what I see most often is a few things. First, there's a purpose gap. Organizations often feel pressured or compelled to start with the tool and say, should we use AI, right? Instead of starting with the question, what decision are we trying to improve, or what problem are we trying to solve, right? And I learned that very clearly, that order is very important distinction in my work with Pete. So we were developing this AI-enabled decision support tool for practitioners that we called the Youth Success Roadmap tool. And this, we didn't start with AI. We actually had a problem that we've been grappling with for several years. And this problem was like, how do we help practitioners make better and more individualized service decisions for young people in real time to get them to our outcome of ultimately supporting young adults with lived experience in foster care to enter living wage career-related employment. And AI came as a way to support that, not define it. So that's the first thing that I think is really important to call out. The second is a data clarity gap. And this is a real problem for everybody everywhere. Many organizations I have worked with have data, but as for all of us, it was collected for reporting, not for decision-making, right? The definitions aren't consistent. And there's limited understanding of what the data actually represents. So for instance, key constructs like engagement, stability, the population of focus, or progress aren't consistently defined in measurable terms. So different folks may be using the same term to mean very different things. Definitions aren't explicit enough, and they're not documented. And so if you layer AI on top of that, you're going to get outputs that feel very sophisticated, but aren't actually useful. And then the third, I think, is a capacity and governance gap. So from the AI coaching work that I've done with organizations, and this is some of the kind of sourcing, pulse checking that I've done amongst other nonprofits around AI, is that there's a lot of organizations who are beginning to experiment with AI, but they're doing so cautiously and often without clear governance structures. And so we found that, right, like, they're piloting these small experiments with guardrails, but they lack the infrastructure and guidance to scale it responsibly. So I'm so glad that this is happening. AI is surfacing longstanding gaps in data and strategy and decision-making, but it's not solving them. So that's where I see it the most.
Thank you, Erika. Oh, sorry. Pete, go ahead. So bring the evaluation and analytics lens to this, right? What's the common thread you see across, picking up on what Erika is saying, across different organizational use cases in terms of what organizations are getting right or wrong with their data for use in AI?
Yeah, so a little context too. When we're talking about AI, a lot of my background is actually applying machine learning before we think of the large language model AI. And I just like to distinguish between those. And now there's the advent of AI that everybody's talking about, which is these large language models. I say that because, speaking to Erika's first point, in terms of a lot of times people will take the kind of shiny object and put that before the purpose for what you're trying to do. And that has real implications. In other words, if the tool and a lot of the current AI is driving a lot of these conversations. And the challenge we have from a data and analytics standpoint is there's a real fundamental problem with a lot of the current AI that we have, which is that it's this issue that everything that it does predictively, predicting the next word, even some of its logical reasoning, is based on correlation or reinforcement learning. It's not based on causation. The issue with that is when we all believe as humans that a correlation in our minds gets interpreted as causation, we just assume they're the same thing oftentimes. And that affects how services are delivered, what we do, and that's where a lot of the bias comes in. So one of the fundamental challenges we have is that how we approach the analysis, current AI is really focused on prediction, which is correlational, associational, not causal. That creates unfairness, creates bias, it perpetuates biases in data. And so one of the first things we have to start to care much more about, and I really worry that a lot of our AI application from a data standpoint is not starting from the desire to actually understand the difference between causal and correlational and how that has implications for fairness in terms of kind of just how we interpret what's coming out answer-wise. Specifically along those lines, when it comes to the data side and looking at that, having clear data, the second piece that Erika was talking about as well, I'm going to be very practical. We have to start thinking of our data not as a bunch of fields in a huge program administrative data set. We need to do what we do in an evaluation world, which is we need a logic model or theory of change all of our variables or data points. Are we measuring context? Are we measuring all the different dimensions of service delivery, quantity and quality? You can now mix methods. You can actually have text data and categorical and numeric data all together. But are we measuring the program experience? And are we measuring outcomes, not just outputs? And so we literally have to start to frame our data, pull the variable sets out and frame it. Logic model, theory of change. This is evaluation 101. We've got to plan and frame the way our data is structured. Why is that important? Because the first step towards getting towards causality is teaching machines to take things stepwise. We build our theory, we test our theory, and there's certain ways we have to analyze our data to make sure we're getting closer to causality. Not perfection, but getting away from correlation, which is where a lot of biases occur. And so along those lines, and I'm going to get later on to some of the conversation that Erika was speaking to as well, sort of the capacity and governance issue, because I think there's going to be a lot of stuff we're going to talk about in terms of security, confidentiality, but that's an important element of this, is how do we keep this data safe? That's actually technically much more feasible now. People are really worried about it, but you can really do this work, but you do have to set up your environment and space and have governance rules in place. We're learning a lot pretty quickly about that. We'll speak to that more later.
Great. Thanks, Pete. So Erika, so Pete just laid out the importance of grounding your data in a theory of change and being clear about what you're actually measuring, which goes back to your point about defining your data, right? So you've lived this in practice, right? When you were building predictive AI tools at First Place for Youth. Tell us a little bit about how you approach defining the boundaries of the system, right? Like what data goes in, what stays out, and who's accountable for those decisions.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I apply the same boundaries that I would to any sort of I love the way Dr. Eve Shapiro in the session before said, like, little e activities, right? Like these are program improvement, regular program evaluation, which is predominantly what I do. So I feel really strongly, I apply the same rules. I feel very strongly about it because it's one of the biggest risks with AI. And it blurs the boundaries that I think should be very explicit, right? When you're working with data in general. So in my work, I define a couple of different types of boundaries. First, like I mentioned before, it's the decision boundary, right? I start with what is the specific decision or workflow this tool is supporting, and I do that with any of the work, right, that I'm doing with organizations, whether it's around building learning and data use culture or infrastructure or some other kind of capacity building effort. And most orgs who are collecting data are often collecting too much. So I'm often the person who comes in and says, why are you collecting this data? What use does it actually serve? If it's not keeping the lights on and you're not using it to make a decision or support practice or operations workflow, why are you collecting it? So I think there's a little bit of a cleaning house that has to come into play and using that decision-making lens. With the work that I did with Pete, the boundary was very clear. It was not making decisions. It was a decision support tool. So AI was not making decisions. It was information to help practitioners make decisions, right? It didn't replace their clinical judgment. It was really designed to help them with prioritizing services and milestones. So this distinction really matters because I think we can all agree that AI should augment human judgment, not replace it, right? So that's the first boundary. The second one is, again, the data boundary. Then we define the data boundary with much more specific parameters and with discipline, right? And this is kind of speaking a little bit more to what Pete said. This includes what data is included, what data is excluded, and why. And that's why I think it's really, really important to not give, like, logic modeling is really, really important for some of this work because it is the logic of humans that's grounded in practice-based evidence, right? And what we know about the work, what we know about the folks that we're in service to. And so we can't leave that to machines and algorithms to decide. We actually have to set the architecture for the data that tells the story, and then the machine learning and the LLMs can support our interpretation of it, our use of it, et cetera. So like I said before, we have to interrogate how the data itself is defined and constructed. We should be asking things like, what does each variable actually represent? How is it defined and operationalized in practice? Is that definition consistent across contexts like program sites, departments? Because if the underlying constructs are unclear or inconsistent, AI doesn't resolve that. It actually scales the inconsistency, right? We should also be asking, what does the data not capture? Because in the social sector, data, what's missing is often as important as what's present, right? Lived experience and context and informal supports are often invisible. I'm going to talk more about that later. And entire populations could be underrepresented. So defining the data boundary is not just about what goes into the model, it's about understanding the meaning and the limitations and the gaps within that data before we ever use it, right? There's an accountability boundary, which explicitly defines like who's going to interpret the outputs, right? Who acts on those outputs and who is accountable, right? I always say, we're trying to fight this myth that we're actively trying to that AI is making the decisions, but it's actually not. And in practice, we should be building systems and practices where humans are in the group and computers are in the loop, right? That's the way I like to think about it. And then finally, there's an ethical boundary, and we should be defining where the tool should not be used. So we were very clear in our guidance when we were developing the youth roadmap tool. We developed a whole set of practice guidance for using the tool, and we were very explicit about where the tool should not be used and where it should be used. So things like high stakes decisions where there is a chance of significant harm if we were wrong, the tool is not used for that. The context where data is incomplete or it's biased, right? And situations where community consent isn't clear. And so those are the main ones. And I will say one more thing. I think we also need to, particularly in the current environment around data, we have to define what I'd call a visibility boundary, where we're asking ourselves, where do we have enough data to responsibly act? And where are we operating in the dark?
Right. Thanks, Eric. Pete, I heard you nodding to Erika there in a bit. So you made such an important point about the logic model grounding the data architecture, and I see an audience from a question from the audience about that I think really connects really well to what you were both saying, right? So Pete, you talked about causality and correlation. So the question is, how do you balance causality with contribution? Pete, this feels like it's right in your lane. Can you speak to that and maybe ground it in a practical example for folks who are thinking about this for their own organization?
Sure. So where we're going, one of the most important foundations from a data standpoint to understand causality is understanding something important that we don't all, unless you're research trained or an evaluator, understand a term called selection bias. At its root, it's this. If we're going to understand causality, the first thing we have to do is ask this fairness question. Whenever you look at a program and you see, let's say there's a correlation between the program and whatever outcome metric is of success, is that correlation causal? And I'll get to the contribution part about this. Well, in order to answer that, we all know if you were the person with the lived experience receiving the programming, or you were on the practitioner in that relationship, one of the things you're going to ask is, well, it really depends. Like, is it a correlation? Depends on the person, the folks coming in, what their circumstances in their life are, how much they've been exposed to similar types of program like this in the past, what's their baseline of where they're starting, and to compare those that may be at a starting place, a brand new experience for somebody who has all kinds of other contextual factors in their life that will affect how they engage in the program. Will they participate in the after-school program the same way as somebody else if there's certain kinds of programming? It's going to depend on what everybody comes in with. So one of the cornerstones of understanding causality is first trying to understand that we have to better, more precisely disaggregate the populations we serve into respectful groups that we know are coming in from different places. And then we study and look at the relationship, the association between the program and the outcome. And here's what we often discover. The recipe for success is not the same for everybody. Precision medicine understands this. But the biggest fundamental thing we have to do in our data is start capturing what I call context data. These are the factors that will affect if and how people engage in a program. The other piece of this is it's critically important to not sort of match or break into subgroups based on factors that should not be selection criteria for a program. So if race or gender is not a factor, should not be a factor in whether somebody gets a program, the same program experience, we should not be looking at those. Later on, we can evaluate whether everybody's getting things fairly. There's these fundamental pieces that I'm describing, which is we need to start disaggregating our populations and appreciating what we need to say is who's in a different place of readiness for our program, and there are different conditions. That's the start of the piece of causality. The other piece is another hard part, which is coming to agreement as stakeholder groups as to what's the measure of success. This is not derived from research literature. It's an agreed upon with people with the lived experience participants and those that know what's possible and feasible with the program. With these two anchors, we kind of understand the different groups, what works for them, and then we can also all be speaking to trying to achieve a similar types of outcome. They can be adjusted by those groups. We get closer to an understanding of causation. All of that is really critical to being able to embrace this. And when we talk about contribution versus causal, what I will tell you is AI and machine learning is never 100% accurate. Okay, life is just not that way. So we have to embrace the idea that in the error, in other words, if we're 70% confident that this seems to work for this group of people, we have to admit that 30% of cases we still don't know. And this is where the relationship between practitioners and those with lived experience and the continuous learning is to actually understand that error, actually embrace that, to say, these are things we don't know we can learn from. I'm going to give you a really world example. We learned for one group in a foster care setting that there was a certain challenge with respect to achieving permanent legal permanency, even though they were getting what we knew for that group worked. Turned out when we talked to the practitioners, they said, guess what? These particular people that you're talking about, we haven't documented in our data, but all of the families are having a hard time having that kid come back because they're all in and out of homelessness. It hadn't been captured. The data was not there. How did we discover that? Because there was something we couldn't explain. There was error. In the real learning, we're learning what that is. And we have to embrace the idea. We're never 100% certain, so there's no pure causality. But we're moving towards that contribution piece by understanding, well, we can explain some of this, but how can we learn? And this is the people side where AI ends. And this is the people relationship side. Ask questions and learn from the things that the AI can't explain and have it be very transparent with just how certain it is. Pay attention to that and leave the rest to the practitioners, those with lived experience, and the continuous learning of the people.
I'll just also add, I think that requires, that's an adaptive leadership skill and challenge, right? The adoption of AI. And it requires knowing how to engage in evaluative thinking and systems thinking around how you structure, these different data sets and where do you fill gaps and where do you focus your attention? So that's one of the things that I see come up pretty commonly is like that needs to be in place, that muscle.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Pete. And thanks, Erika. So this idea that the recipe for success isn't the same for everyone, and the people closest to the work, including those with lived experiences, need to be part of defining what success looks like. It's such an important point, and really enjoyed that conversation there. For me, it raises a real tension, right? Because we're in a moment where the landscape around data is shifting, right? Access to publicly available data is changing. Organizations are navigating real questions about privacy and risk. And there's understandable caution about how data may be used. So, and all while AI adoption is accelerating. Erika, I know you and Kelly Fitzsimmons, the CEO of Project Evident, are writing about some of these tensions, right? What does this moment mean for organizations trying to use data responsibly?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think this is actually the defining challenge of the moment when it comes to our work. Like you said, we're in this paradox where AI is advancing beyond rapidly. Like I can never I don't even know how I begin to keep up with it. But the data ecosystem that supports it is actually in some ways weakening. and that's concerning. Kelly and I have talked about, and we're outlining in the paper, this kind of trend of shrinking access to federal data sets and dismantling of evaluation units that we're seeing in nonprofit organizations because budgets are shrinking, increased restriction on collecting disparity-related data. Some folks are calling this an open war on data. That's a little extreme, but I think we're calling it more of a growing data drought, right? And so what's the risk? The risk is that we start using AI to make decisions in environments where we can see less and less, right? So AI doesn't solve the problem of weak data systems. It actually makes the consequences of them more visible, because gaps in the data get treated as absence of need, because AI thinks a pattern in the data reflects reality when it actually reflects a flaw or a gap or a bias in how the data was created, collected, or reported, and inequities become harder to detect, not easier. So data loss equals loss of visibility equals loss of power. And one of the points we're going to be making is that when data disappears, communities don't just lose information, they lose visibility. And when communities become invisible, disparities become harder to prove, programs become harder to defend, and resources become harder to justify. So this is not just a technical issue, it is a power issue. At the same time that data is disappearing, we're also seeing increased concerns about surveillance, especially in communities that are already over-surveilled. So organizations are caught between collecting too much data, which risks harm, and not having enough data, which risks invisibility, right? So that's how I'm seeing it right now. And so what do we do? I think the response is not more data or less data. I think it's, number one, be intentional about what data you collect. So focus on what is necessary, what is ethical, and what aligns with your mission, right? Two, invest in data stewardship. One of the things that I think we argue is that data should be treated like a very valuable asset, right? Talent and finance, something to be like data the way we treat those kinds of data, something to be protected, governed, and used wisely. I think another thing is we should be using AI as a catalyst, not a shortcut. So AI should push organizations to actually strengthen their data systems, to clarify their outcomes, and build measurement capacity. And then finally, I think adopting a posture of cautious experimentation, I think, is really critical. So what we're seeing across organizations, including in the coaching work I've done, is that small pilots and clear guardrails and strong human oversight is highly effective. And I think that's the right posture for the moment that we're in.
No, thank you, Erika. So the tension you're describing, and between needing more and better data while also protecting the communities that the data represents, right? It's surreal, and that's something we grapple with at Project Evident all the time. Pete, this connects to something you raised earlier when we were prepping together, like for organizations worried about privacy and risk, right? That they're sitting in that tension right now. What do they need to understand about what's still possible, right? Like you talked about what can they do and how much can they do? What do you want people to understand about the fact that good analytics doesn't not necessarily require exposing private information, and a lot can be done potentially without personally identifiable data?
Yep. So one of the things I just want to hit home really hard is that to do the kind of analytics we're talking about, to do causal modeling, to figure out what works for whom under what circumstances, not with 100% certainty, but to be able to explain and nudge everybody in the right direction to help everybody, that does not require identifiable information. The number one thing I can tell you is, technically speaking, you can completely de-identify the data and still work with it. So what does that look like? So I did a project on financial inclusion where we modeled bank and institution data. We actually worked with the Bank of Brazil, this is for the World Bank, and the Bank of Brazil was very sensitive. We could not get any of that data out. They actually went as far as to de-identify and create synthetic data before they exported it for the modeling process, for the analytics. We are now in a space where you can de-identify. There are tools, methodologies that can easily de-identify data. Most of the work that I've done historically used no identifying information in the modeling, first place for youth or any of it. You can also set up secure environments, protected environments, where you can do all this work, including applying machine learning and data analytics and statistical modeling in a safe, secure environment. If you do have identifiable information, the infrastructure is all technologically there. I say that not to, the stuff that Erika was sharing is a real issue, which is we are in threat of losing a lot of our data, the government data, other types of data. There's a lot of issues with respect to that. At the same time, all organizations are gathering more data, and it's only going to get more demanding because everybody with machine learning and AI is going to demand more of it. I would actually put out a call that goes one step further as a part of the solution. And this is something we're really looking at Project Evident as well, is there's the idea that if we all started de-identifying, creating synthetic data, which is data that looks like the real cases, has the pattern of the real cases, but is no real case. And if that sounds like untrustworthy, it has gotten very far. A whole nother session later, I could talk about it. But you can do synthetic and de-identified data. Imagine what we could do if we started creating, and I would say even with a moat around it, more shared de-identified data within domains and program areas where we could start to actually get the kind of learning and opportunities with safe data, safe governance, and I would say kind of with a clear moat around it, so that it becomes a sacred place, if you will, for learning and continuous learning amongst everyone, but in a safe, more secure environment. And I think at some point, we need to shift our orientation. Protect data. You do not need identifiable data. That's a real concern. All that Erika and I know that Kelly are working on, all true. At the same time, there's a flip side of the coin that says, hey, there's some things we can begin to do with the tools, technology, and secure infrastructure that's available to us. We can start to build repositories of data that would take things to a whole nother level that actually I think could be better than some of the publicly available data now, because that data is always been structured or built for our learning purposes.
Thanks so much, Pete. I'm being reminded that we need to start. We're coming up on our audience Q&A. We want to make sure we have enough time to do that. So I want to wrap it up a little bit. Thank you so much, Pete and Erika. We've covered a lot of ground today. So from the importance of starting with the problem you're trying to solve rather than the tool, to being disciplined about what data goes into a model and why, to understanding that rigorous analytics doesn't require exposing identifiable or private information. So let me close with this, right? If there is one thing you want people in this room to carry with them about data and AI, what would it be? Erika, I'll start with you, and then Pete, you can go after that before we open up to audience Q&A.
Sure. I think it would be AI is only as equitable as the data systems and decisions that surround it. And so if we care about impact, which we all do, we have to invest in those foundations first.
And I will get on my one soapbox issue, which I let off with, which is causality really matters. Figuring out what works for whom, under what circumstances. We should never keep striving to roll up everything into one average metric and one thing that works. We're fooling ourselves if that's the case. The opportunity is to figure out what works for whom, under what circumstances, and make causality matter. Respect where people are coming from, meet them where they are, and figure out what works. We now have the capability of doing it, but it's a very different orientation. Correlation repeats and promulgates bias, and AI is putting it on steroids.
Those are great final words, Pete. Putting it on steroids. So, all right. So we're going to move on to the audience Q&A portion. Please feel free to share questions here. We answered one already around causality and contribution. We have two other great questions that I think are kind of connected. So organizations are often collecting data because different funders require different things, and that can lead to collecting a lot without clarity about what's actually useful, right? So The question is, how do you get more intentional about what you collect? And can AI actually help with that rather than just adding more complexity? I'm going to start with Erika again, and then Pete.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to hear how, Pete, you're thinking about how AI can support this, but this is the most common challenge that I face, both as someone who's an evaluation practitioner and someone who's supporting other organizations in this. And I think there is always going to be a certain percentage of data that we have to collect for funders, for compliance, to keep the lights on. That's just kind of, par for the course in doing this work. I think one of the things that I have learned is that it's important to understand what the Venn diagram looks like for compliance data and program relevant, evidence informed, decision relevant, and useful data, right? And there's usually a Venn diagram where there's a certain amount of overlap there. And so assessing kind of what that Venn diagram looks like. And then as an internal evaluation practitioner, I've actually done a lot in the way of partnering with funders and contract officers, government folks, to actually have the conversations about why it's important to collect this data, not this data, and being proactive about what that data looks like, because the people who are most impacted by the work and impact the work are the ones I think know the best about what should be collected and what's most useful. So I think part of this is about partnering and creating a shared vision with the folks that you're providing this compliance data to help them to help them understand, to come to some agreements about what is useful data, what's important data, and why. And so that's one of the things that I do to help kind of basically prune some of that data away. And if there's stuff that's compliance and decision related data, we double down on that. We get really good at defining that. We get really good, because that's also going to be something that's reinforced in our collection, right? That's usually the best collected data, because it's not only useful, but people are looking at it and funding is tied to it. So that tends to be the highest quality data that you're going to get. And so we focus on that in terms of what can we use this data for to capitulate our learning, and also how do we expand it and how do we address gaps?
What I would say really quickly, just to add to that, is I'll bring it back to, I think, one of the most fundamental places to determine what you measure, and that's the relationship between the practitioner and those they work with. We need to get into this space and start to ask a question, a really fundamentally important question. All monitoring, evaluation, everything else comes down to who decides the outcome. Quite frankly, in my opinion, a lot of times when outside funding comes in, we have what I call outcomes delusions of grandeur. Metrics that they can't possibly say that this program moved the needle on. It's not an attribution. If you're funding teacher professional development, that's a 6-week summer program for teachers, and asking if the kids' science test scores improved, the program didn't touch the kids. Stop asking these outcome questions that are just delusional. The reason being is because we're never going to learn if we don't measure the outcomes we can move the needle on. So the outcomes we choose to measure, and by the way, we shouldn't measure outcomes where we have 100% success, and we shouldn't measure outcomes where we have 0% success. You should shoot for outcomes that are 50%, because that gives you an opportunity to learn. And if you're getting it easy, change your outcome. But it should be determined, if we didn't have proxy buyers and whoever was being served had to pay, what would their outcome be? And what would the practitioner say they could help them with? That's where we need to start the conversation. We need to start measuring the program experience through their eyes. And I think one of the most important things to remember is every row in a data set is a person's life story through that journey through the program, in relation to whoever's providing the program and whoever's living and experiencing that. I think we need to start getting grounded in all of our measurement through these lenses. What would they want? And but make that bar a decent level. And that's where a lot of our learning can happen. And then the way data improves, when you create that space for the practitioner and the person being served in partnership together, when you make that measurement space matter in terms of what really you're going to move the needle on, the kind of program experiences to measure, and you provide real-time feedback. This is where AI comes in, and machine learning and other stuff. You can provide real-time feedback to them about what's working, what's not, what we know, what we don't know, what the data can and cannot say. You have the experience I've experienced, which is data quality improves because practitioners come back and say, hey, like the example I gave before, we want to measure family homelessness. We haven't done it yet. We don't need these metrics because they prove to not matter. And what you end up doing by making that space, the sacred space of where your measurement questions should be derived, practitioner and the person with lived experience, with some technical expertise in terms of help around how to build those metrics, but the ownership of what they're looking for and the quality of the experience is there, and there's real-time feedback. You'll be amazed at how much the data quality starts to get improved, because once they start using the information in real time, you get these variables don't matter. Why are we collecting it anymore? Get rid of it. These are the things that do matter, and we want to gather some things we want more in order to learn. And it is amazing how quickly the data starts to evolve and get better. And that would be a grassroots up approach to building, again, that whole idea of starting to bring these programs and domains together. I think we have to flip who gets to choose. It should be informed, it should be hard to get the metric of success, but it should be possible. And then it should be agreed upon really at the space between where the practitioner and those they serve are together.
Just also say, Pete, just to add a simple operating shift that helps to address that and has been, I think, highly effective as somebody who's experienced it and helps other organizations, is when you're developing grant proposals and contracts, make sure you have the right people at the table. Right? Make sure your evaluation folks, if you have an evaluation person, make sure that person's in the loop, because they can provide that reality testing. They can also be very, very convincing and an ally in supporting why certain data is important to collect over other pieces of data, including the folks who are the practitioners and users and super users of the information.
Absolutely.
No. Thank you, Pete and Erika. So want to get some of the other audience questions here. There's a question about use of synthetic data. Where can we learn more about how to do this? I think we have plans to send out some resources, right, Pete? Is that something?
It's funny. I don't have a particular. I've been sourcing this in the context of a lot of work. What you're raising for me is a need to put out more information about this, because this is one of those areas that I think is huge opportunity to develop data repositories where we can all learn together in the most secure way. Even de-identified is great too, but if somebody really want to move in that direction, I think your question behooves me to put something together, because most of it has been in service to a lot of the project work that I've done.
Did you use synthetic data with us, didn't you? You kind of developed, did you use that?
Well, we do some processes
tool?
where we're trying to, in the modeling process, or times that we leverage synthetic data to run what we call simulated experiments. And during that process, we would create similar cases so that we could run controlled experiments in a simulated way. And that's one of the techniques of modeling that's very profound. And there's a way to do that within there.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Cool.
Pete. So look out for resources that Pete will build himself.
I'm sure there are great
Thanks,
resources.
Pete.
By the way, there's probably some great resources out there. I know, because I've leveraged some of the literature on this pretty heavily. But we do need a more lay type of publications or newsletter, something that can help us all understand it more. I know technical resources, but I think we need to pull together a better document to help share everybody what it is.
Great. Thank you, Pete. And one of the last questions here, are there outcome standards that you are watching, like the Impact Genome Registry, that will help with sharing outcome data across organizations? Yeah, the Impact Genome Registry, we can put the link on here. It's a repository of many nonprofits and social programs on standardized data. I have not played with it myself, but yeah.
That's a really good question, and I'm going to look into it, because I don't know. I mean, there's a couple of websites. There's one, I'm blanking on the name of it, but there is one that actually you can type in, I want to assess this construct, and it will give you validated, standardized tools and measures. And I will send that out, because I can't remember the name of it offhand, but I've used that quite a bit. So it gives you not only the kind of outcome standards and how it should be measured, but it also gives you, I don't think it gives you benchmarks, right? But it does, like evidence-informed benchmarks, but it does give you outcomes, and it gives you some really good tools that you could use that have already kind of, some of the work has already been done to standardize and norm it with various different populations that should be obviously similar or the same as to the one you're serving.
I'm going to share one thing along these lines, which may be kind of a different perspective. When it comes, I get very I did a project once with Think of Us, and their motto is like nothing to us without us. I hope I'm not butchering that. But when it comes to standardization and what I've seen as to how we need to start disaggregating data, one size doesn't fit all. I've actually used a lot of data that is been tests and measured. It's statistically reliable, Crumbacks, alphas, scales, all this kind of stuff. And it's the same idea of standardization and standard metrics. The challenge we have is that when you actually start to use that data and you disaggregate populations based on who they are, their context, and what their situation and starting place is, and we actually run a race, the scaled score, the standard, and where that threshold is set or benchmark, and compare that to what's needed for each of those unique contexts, you actually harm people sometimes when you go with whatever that threshold or standard is, or the scale as it's measured. So I just want to share with you all that I'm very nervous about, we have this tendency, and read Todd Rose's book, The End of Averages, we have this tendency, and I know for policy reasons why we do, we want to develop these specific standards. I like the idea of having measures, like certain things that we know are getting at the same construct. But before you start setting thresholds and start setting kind of weights for what they measure, we need to get away from the idea that you're going to find one scale that somehow means the same thing to everybody when they take it. And so I think we really have to start to also form these standards where the thresholds are set in a more disaggregated way. And I don't think it should be something top down that's coming out of research alone. We need some rigor, but I think we need collaboration with actually those in the driver's seat should be those who it's going to affect and impact. And I think we have to get to a place where the opportunity with AI and machine learning is to disaggregate and meet people where they are. It's messier, but the idea that one size fits all, that there's an average, a standard, or a threshold that's going to get us where we need to go, it might move the average, but it'll hurt some too, because that average can move up, even if, you know, a small percentage get worse off because of that standard you're setting. So I really think we have to reorient and get back down to how do we decide what those standards and thresholds are. And I think we have to move away from kind of averages. I know it's not easy, but it is totally possible.
Well said. Yeah, well said, Pete.
Just a reminder that the resources that the speakers mentioned will be uploaded to the AirMeet platform after the event. And that's accessible even after today's over. And also there's a little paper icon to the right of your when you look to the right of this platform, and there's a resources button, and there's already a lot of resources that were uploaded already. So one question I had, right? So based on what you guys were just talking about, and then maybe a lot of people in the room are already thinking, right? For organizations that are still building their data foundations and are kind of starting to explore AI or trying to get ready for AI, like what would you say is the single most important thing that they should focus on first?
I mean, I think this is probably just redefining what I said, but I think it's important to start with clarity, not technology, right? Okay. So getting clear on what decisions are you trying to make better? What does success actually look like? What is the minimum data we need to learn and improve? Because what I've seen is that when you get those things right, the path to AI becomes much clearer, right? And when you don't, AI just adds noise to an already unclear system. Many of the organizations I've worked with are not waiting until everything is perfect either, which is good. They're starting small, learning and iterating. And I think people will be the first one to say, you don't need a ton of data, right? You just need the right data, and it needs to be good quality data. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, you don't need a ton of data. I think that one of the most important things you have to do is deliberately do the planning work. I'll put a plug in here for some project evidence, our strategic evidence planning, but whatever it is, the principles of it are in there, in the sense that what you need to do is make sure that you really look at what's the purpose. I'm coming back to something, Erika, you said earlier on. It's like, what's the purpose? And it's really what you're hitting on so importantly, which is it's why, what do you need to collect? What answers are you looking for? You need to understand your theory of change, your logic model, and please engage those you serve. You'd be surprised. Don't be afraid to ask them, what are your outcomes? What do you want? And whichever ones are saying the hardest outcome for you to help them with, that's your outcome. Help them understand. I facilitated an entire causal modeling process where our entire design committee were people with lived experience in foster care, and they were leading the whole process step by step. We provided technical assistance along the way, but it was amazing. And by the way, in some cases, tougher than what we would all ask ourselves if we were to do this, if we're inside programs, and maybe more realistic for the policymakers and funders who are trying to make some decisions at a bigger level. So plan, frame, and talk to folks and get that stakeholder buy-in. All the stuff we've been doing for years and talking about for years in evidence planning is what's here. And then marry that with the data. Align your data with those plans. And I promise, with real-time feedback and everything else, that data is going to get better and better and better. And share.
Yeah. I think the most powerful way to get people on board with technology is to center individuals with lived experience and what is important to them and collecting that, right? So if you don't have, if the communities you're serving don't think that the outcomes that you're collecting or you're moving towards are the right ones, then you gotta revisit your theory of change or your logic model. So always starting there. And that actually compels people to get more on board, because we're not in this work to be millionaires, right? We're in this work to be mission driven and to support the value system of the organizations that we have joined. And I think that's one critical intersection where if you're really, right, if you want to bring folks along in the data and technology journey, then you have to center individuals who are most impacted and get there. And a construct may look very different. Like I work a lot in the space of economic mobility. What does economic mobility look like, right? How do we measure that? It's a very broad term and it means a lot of different things to different people. And when I've actually worked with the folks who are receiving the services, the participants, the communities, it's defined very differently than the way we define it, right? And so I think starting there is a really, really important and valuable place as a change management strategy.
Yeah, that is such an important point to end on. Thank you so much, Erika and Pete, for such a rich conversation. So I'm going to direct folks, if you have more questions for Erika and Pete, you can ask questions of speakers in the lounge area. And we're going to wrap up with that. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Erika, and thank you, Pete. Such an important conversation.
Thank you, Farhana. Great.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Erika. We'll see you all.